A 32-year-old Kerala native Binil T B has been killed while fighting in the Russian army on the front lines of the ongoing war with Ukraine. His relative, 27-year-old Jain T K, has sustained serious injuries. The two men, both from Vadankasheri in Kerala's Thrissur district, had been struggling to return home for months, with Binny's wife Joycey remaining in contact with the Indian embassy in Moscow throughout the ordeal. The family learnt of Binil's death after Joycey received a message from embassy officials confirming the tragic news. The officials reportedly informed her that they had received confirmation from the Russian army. However, the family had initially been informed a few days earlier that the two men had been injured in a drone attack, but they had been unable to reach them directly for clarification. Sanish, who is a relative, spoke about the distressing situation to the Indian Express, stating Joycey had been in touch with the Indian embassy in Moscow, and when she called the officials, they confirmed that Binil had passed away. They said they got the information from the Russian army. Ajit Kolasari, the CEO of Norca Routes, which is the state government agency for non-resident Keralites, expressed concern over the situation. He said, and I quote, "We have heard about the incident and are awaiting final confirmation from the Ministry of External Affairs. For the past couple of months, we have been trying to bring these individuals back, but we are unsure of how many Keralites are still stuck in the Russian army. We only learn about these incidents when people make distress calls." Binil and Jain had been desperately trying to return home for months, having initially traveled to Russia in search of employment in military support roles. Speaking to the Indian Express last December, Binil had detailed the hardships he and Jain faced. Since September, they had been contacting the Indian embassy in Moscow seeking help to return home, but their efforts were unsuccessful. In one message, Binil had said, "We are now in difficult terrain in a Russia-occupied Ukraine. Our commander says our contract was for a year, but we have been pleading with local commanders for release. The Indian embassy says they can't help unless we are relieved by the Russian army and brought back to the Russian territory." The two men had initially been promised a salary of 2 lakh rupees per month, but they reported they never received the promised payment. Their duties included carrying the dead and wounded from the battlefield to the base camp. The men had traveled to Russia on private visas with the help of relatives already in the Russian army, but that a relative was among several Indians discharged earlier this year after the Indian government intervened. This marks the second death of a Keralite fighting for the Russian army under the guise of military support jobs. In August last year, Sandeep, who was another native of Thrissur, was killed in a drone attack. Binil and Jain were among many Indian youth who traveled to Russia in April last year, lured by the promise of work in roles such as electrician, cooks, and drivers. However, they were coerced to giving up their Indian passports, taking permanent residence, and ultimately being conscripted into the Russian army to fight on the front lines. There are currently around 10 other Indian nationals who have contacted the embassy for help, and Indian officials are working with Russian authorities to secure their release. In July last year, Russia promised the early release of all Indians fighting in its army, which is a pledge made after Prime Minister Narendra Modi raised the issue with Russian President Vladimir Putin during a visit to Moscow. To date, around 45 Indians have been discharged from the Russian military, with some already returned home while others are still awaiting their paperwork.